everybody. It is beyond wonderful to be here. I'm just kind of overwhelmed with obviously the beauty, but also from the moment I was introduced to the organization and the idea behind this event, just so inspired by the work that's being done here, the desire to connect this kind of academic research to the making and the physicality of the place. And I'm just, just so excited to be here and learn so much from everybody. And I'm already looking at people's research and just know I'm already learning so much. So because we're really focused on stone here, I wanted to start a bit with my own ground in Southern Ontario, where I have to say my connection to ground and rock feels so much more distant. I think I feel like I'm often looking for it, and I don't always find it. But right now I'm with a landscape architecture studio, and we're doing a project in the Niagara Escarpment. So this is a place, a kind of limestone formation that is so powerful. So for me, this is an exciting thing to recognize about my environment. But maybe more typically, I'm thinking about my environment in terms of the aggregate mining that happens all around Southern Ontario. So we have a lot of limestone, and we have a lot of till, kind of glacial till, so a lot of aggregates that are being used for the construction industry. And we have a major boom, kind of construction boom that's occurring in the Kitchener-Waterloo region. So tons of towers are going up, and I think we can think about all of the mining and quarrying. That's kind of the bulk basis of these of this construction boom. And at the same time, so this is I know that maybe the images are a bit hard to see. Are you able to see them okay? So this is an image of a plot of land where my university is, and it's called the Haldeman Tract. And it's a big piece of land that was promised by the British Crown to the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations. And right now, there's just a very small part of that that's still kind of under stewardship by the Six Nations. And this past year, the Haudenosaunee chiefs have declared a moratorium across the whole Haldeman Tract. So this is a major urbanized area, and they basically have said there should be no development here without consultation with us, because they're stating their right to be stewards of the land. And so unfortunately, there has been almost no response to this, but I guess I wanted to start with this as a form of an acknowledgement of the place I am, and also thinking about, the emphasis of this conference in terms of reconnecting, kind of, as has been so beautifully spoken about already, reconnecting to history, reconnecting to place, and the kind of the complexity of that as a kind of in a settler colonial environment. So my research is really coming from my previous practice as a landscape architect, specifying materials and being so interested in where they were coming from, but also having the experience of feeling like I was just shopping. It was like, I'm going to have one of those, and that one's pink, and this one's shiny, and really wanting to know more about the bigger picture of these materials. And so, as we all know, we're kind of often in design practices, we're really often working with, let's say I was really working with products, with suppliers. And so trying to get the backstory of the wood, like what is the growing conditions of the wood? What are the mining and labor conditions of the metals? What are the fabrication conditions of the brick? These things I think can be difficult to find. And so my research started from this curiosity. And also, I suppose, as a kind of landscape-oriented person, kind of a desire to recognize that those, while making a landscape in one place with these materials, there were these associated landscapes that were being transformed by the production of those materials. So wanting to both know where those things were coming from, but also wanting to assert a relationship between them, even though it feels very invisible. So this work is really about trying to connect development, so urban development, all forms of construction, and understand, a larger relationship to land, and then using these construction materials as a bit of a method, so a way to connect us. If the faraway sources of these materials is very elusive, we can just look at the thing that we're actually building with and use that as a guide to find them. So a lot of my recent work has been directed towards this book called Reciprocal Landscapes, Stories of Material Movements. And I thought I would share one of the chapters, which is about an island of stone. So I thought it was, and it's also something I haven't really spoken about before. So I was excited to do that from this incredible island of stone. So the book, just kind of broadly speaking, the book, each chapter of the book follows a construction material, a landscape material. So the first, I'll talk a little bit about them in a second. But each of the chapters follows a material from fertilizer to granite paving blocks to structural steel to street trees to tropical hardwood. And in each chapter, I used New York City public landscapes, kind of well-loved, well-known public landscapes as my cases. And so each chapter follows a material that ended up in New York City in a kind of well-loved, well-known public landscape. And then I trace that back to a place, an origin or a location, and try to develop or try to understand a relationship between the two places. And so interested in the kinds of themes that arise if you're looking at let's say a quarried material versus a cultivated material versus a material from an old growth forest. So, and the cases also span about 30 years between them. And the idea was to look at changing paradigms, changing economic and political moments, changing paradigms about what was popular or what was kind of desirable in terms of material use. And also, I was interested in how the designers of those spaces were conceptualizing this relationship to material extraction, or a larger understanding of people to land relationships. And this is a map showing how all of these materials kind of ended up in or connected to these New York City places. And so just very briefly on the different chapters, the first chapter is about guano fertilizer that ended up in Central Park, a very small amount in the 1860s to fertilize the meadows. And this was coming from coastal Peru and was part of a kind of larger move to a kind of turning point in the industrialization of agriculture as cities were growing, and was kind of, the story talks about basically the kind of shift from Atlantic slavery to Pacific slavery, and the labor of Chinese indebted laborers in the extraction of guano. The third chapter is about structural steel that was used, that was produced in Pittsburgh, that was used to cover Riverside Park in the 1930s. And that chapter looks at the kind of WPA era labor support and the role that steel plays in transforming the modern landscape, but also in transforming the Monongahela River in Pittsburgh. So looking at the kind of state of these two rivers next to each other. The fourth chapter is about the cultivation of London plane trees, so large quantities of city street trees that were grown in a New York City Parks Department nursery that were cultivated by incarcerated workers from this kind of jail complex on Rikers Island. And then the 5th chapter is about tropical hardwood, so about the use of ipe, so really durable and beautiful hardwood that comes from northern Brazil and was used in the first phase of the High Line, and looks at the questions of obsolescence, durability, material durability, and this kind of problem of harvesting. The speed of the desire of the harvesting of the wood and the actual growth rate and the possibility of that, the possibility of a so-called sustained harvest. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about this 2nd chapter, which is about granite paving blocks from Vinyl Haven, Maine, that ended up on Broadway. This chapter is about granite paving blocks from coastal Maine that were used to pave Broadway, so major kind of commercial street in New York City. And it's called a range of motions for a few reasons, which I'll talk about. And one of them is that a motion is the colloquial term for a small paving block quarry in New England. But it's also a lot about thinking about the concept of material movement and material flow, both as something like without humans and also with humans. So yeah. So when you look, this is a analysis of granite, and something interesting is that when you look really closely at granite, it's possible to kind of imagine that it is moving, because when molten magma comes through the Earth's surface and it cools very quickly, it's kind of the minerals don't have as much time to form, but when it's cooling slowly under an overlying bedrock, the minerals form more slowly, and so we end up having kind of the grains, this coarse-grained rock, which we know as granite. And so geologists of the 19th century wrote that in some ways you could look at it and actually see it in motion. So it's already a kind of idea about something moving. And the magma that solidified in current-day Vinyl Haven, Maine, is one small piece of a 170-mile-long belt of igneous rock that kind of comes up and down through the surface. And the granite, this is a map of Maine, and it shows the kind of sinuous coastline and archipelago of small islands. And so this was really important. Not only did this granite have incredibly beautiful qualities, it had this kind of nice pink hue, very workable, but it was also located in this archipelago, which made it very, very efficient for getting stone from the quarry to, by water to all of the urbanizing Atlantic centers. So this is a map of Vinyl Haven, which was covered with 42 major quarries in its heyday. And here are the kind of docks that were connecting directly from the quarries to the ships. So when I visited, I took the ferry there, and I climbed, from the ferry to the Vinyl Haven Historical Society, which houses a range of artifacts from the island's cultural history. So you can see quilts, baskets, and furniture all arranged. But there was a kind of large area which really focused on the island's geological history. All things granite, all things related to tools and kind of different samples. You can see these different block sizes, the coarse-grained Manhattan Special, as well as you can see different artifacts from Vinyl Haven's Union history, so the Union organizing of the granite cutters. So all of these kind of artifacts of life that were there. And so when I visited, these two people, Bill Chiles and Sue Radley, were working there in the Historical Society, and they knew that I had asked them if I could learn more about the paving block. So they laid out all of these different binders for me, and one of the most delightful thing that I saw was this binder that says where granite went, and it was kind of exactly what I was looking for. And it was basically an alphabetized list of every kind of documented indication of what was sent out of the island. So some of the early bills of sale talked about early fortifications, so granite that was laid as infrastructure to secure settler colonial agendas. And then pre-Civil War, everything turns towards military form from forts, such as forts. And after the war, the granite contracts became memorials, so war memorials and other kinds of new federal buildings, banks, post offices, all were being made out of this really desirable and beautiful, as they described, super noble material. So along with the where granite went binder were also a couple different displays. This is where the granite came from in different parts of the island display. And then this poster shows there was a certain kind of horse trough, like a carved granite horse trough. And this display shows that there's one in every single state in the United States. And so I thought this was really interesting because when I was there, I was trying to think about trying to learn about what it feels like to have your home, your island, the place where you live kind of disseminated, kind of slowly dug away and sent outward. And so it was interesting to me to be meeting with people who had kind of grown up in this place and witnessed this, and also see all of these kind of documents about the dissemination and the loss. But there was also, I think, Bill, who I spent a bunch of time with, talked a lot about it kind of with a lot of pride. And he was just, saying, I can't believe that, for such a tiny place, we have, we're everywhere. We're in every city. And so I thought that was very interesting. So Bill drove me around the island and he showed me some of the quarries. By the time he was born in the late 1960s, most of the industry had been long gone. There's no granite there's no granite buildings on the island. It all went elsewhere. So this is Bill showing me around. And it was his great-grandfather, Charles, who was a Scottish granite cutter who came to Vinyl Haven in the mid-1800s. And since then, all of his family had worked in granite in New England. The island had 42 major quarries. They produced stone, like everything from kind of very ornate carved eagle kind of sculptural stone to paving blocks. And all of this was distributed around the island, but there were also these very small, so those larger quarries were owned by large companies, but there were also a lot of small, what were called motion quarries, which were hand-focused, very small quarries where paving block was cut directly out of the land, and they were usually owned by just somebody who lived there. And so a lot of those are kind of dispersed, and it's kind of hard to even know what they were. And maybe this reminds me of what was said earlier about starting to look closely and starting to see the human kind of industry where it maybe looks like there wasn't. One of the most prolific quarries was the Sands Quarry, which was shown here around 1875 as it's starting to operate. This is a diagram showing the kind of organization of the quarry based on the predominant kind of geological rift. And this is it in its kind of Middle Ages, where there was a kind of derrick, and it was first marked by a derrick, a rotating crane, that was powered by oxen and people walking away from its center. And then later was powered by engines. There were, kind of in the early 20th century, there were 5 derricks run by 3 engines, 2 surface traveling cranes, steam compressors, pneumatic drills. They were able to carve 30-foot long columns. And so really the site evolved over time. And so Bill and I went there, and he kind of showed me around. And while we were there, we kind of imagined and talked about this site and tried to imagine everything kind of running backwards, like in a film where everything kind of, all the granite kind of like comes back from everywhere that it went and ends up magnetically and miraculously kind of refit together like a big puzzle. And so in the very bottom would be the most recent blocks. like nearing to when the quarry was shut down. So in 1922, halfway up would be the pieces cut in the late 1870s, and all the way at the top where we were standing would be the blocks extracted in the 1860s, when this was really a kind of solid landscape. So stone is splitting, with greatest ease, first along the rift and then along the grain that runs perpendicular to it. And to turn the bedrock from which you stand into identical units, the paving cutter first drills holes. This is a diagram that somebody in the Historical Society made to kind of illustrate this. So you first drill holes along the rift. Large slabs are split off, their faces becoming the top or bottom of future paving blocks. And then sequences again as they're cut into blocks of certain specification based on different contract specifications, which were also changing regularly. So a cutter might make 200 identical paving blocks in a day's work, or 1,000 in a week. Blocks made their way down rails to the docks, into boats headed to urban areas. They were offloaded by longshoremen, driven to construction sites in carts, and then deposited in piles around the city. And then this image is actually from a later time, but it's beautiful, so I wanted to include it, just to convey the idea that the blocks were laid into the street kind of like a parade. So on top of hydraulic cement foundations, clean sand was spread, and then 15 feet behind, a line of block setters aligned blocks perpendicular to the street direction. 6 feet behind, a line of rammermen. So we're ramming the blocks with wood to level. And then 25 feet behind that, people were filling the joints with gravel, bituminous cement, and Portland cement. And so, you see this street kind of taking shape. And I think what's interesting is it seems quite anonymous, but at the time, the New York City street specifications required that, and it was for the purpose of having the most kind of homogeneous streets, granite streets, as possible. They required that you would put low batches of stone from similar quarries together. So in fact, what seemed like kind of totally anonymous stone was actually kind of a regional map of different stone types, which maybe if you were really observant, you might be able to notice. So around this chapter focuses on the kind of 1890s, when there was a huge municipal effort to really repave the city with a major agenda to lubricate the flow of capital, because there was a kind of growing awareness that this was a really important place of transaction, and the streets were a mess. If you can see this image, you can see that horses were like hurting themselves and bleeding, and everyone was, fine. Businessmen were getting tossed off of carts. So there was a real kind of recognition that the smoothness of the city streets was very much aligned with the smooth flow of capital and the ability to kind of gain profit from the urban environment. And so the state undertook a massive repaving project in the 1880s. And at the time, granite on concrete was preferred for heavy business traffic, but there was some variation. So granite was louder, was smooth, but also quite loud. And so there were some areas, like in Wall Street, they laid down asphalt, which was like a little bit quieter and nicer to not bug the bankers' nerves. And Maine was really the place where the majority of this granite was coming from. So this is Broadway. Broadway was, really, really important commercial street. It was a total mess. Everyone was freaking out about how bad the pavement was. So it was a real priority to resurface. And the contract was huge. It was 5 miles long, and just like a lot of granite required. So this describes the different types of materials being specified for different streets. And at the time, the majority of this contract went to a company called the New York and Maine Granite Paving Block Company, which was run by a man named John Pierce, who was later called the Quarry King, because he really had a kind of monopoly, or a huge number of quarries. Some of them were in Vinyl Haven, and he kind of built a bit of an empire through this process. And so this is Broadway kind of in construction. So as Vinyl Haven granite was really flowing towards New York City, Vinyl Haven, and this is an image of Vinyl Haven, was really urbanizing through its subtraction. The population doubled in the late 19th century. Labor policies at first were benefiting workers, and then in 1877, a move towards competitive bids really kind of drastically reduced workers' power and kind of greater their contracts became much more precarious as the kind of industry was growing. And around the same time, there was a shift towards mechanized stone cutting. So there was also all of a sudden, what was kind of a hand-based practice now was like producing dust in a different kind of way, and different kinds of lung disease were really starting to kind of affect people. So around this time, because of this labor precarity and different types of work hazards, the country's first granite cutting union began to organize, and they organized in the area, close to Vinyl Haven. And this organization was quickly kind of met with a response by John Pierce and the Quarry owners organization to try to undermine and make sure that the unions wouldn't gain too much power. So I suppose this was an important place in the country for the development of this unionization. And the story that I want to mention is in the summer of, or in the year of 1892, when, because of these very egregious contract negotiations, quarry workers and paving cutters in Maine and also in Vinyl Haven decided to refuse to sign contracts and were essentially locked out at a large scale. And what's interesting, I think, is that they realized that there was so much paving stone in the material flow that they knew that their striking wouldn't actually affect all of these very lucrative contracts, which were still going to be laid in New York City. And so they connected with the Rammerman. They connected with all of the unions in New York City and kind of developed a bit of a stone workers solidarity movement between these different unions. And so basically, all of these different unions, anyone related to this granite, refused to handle it. And so this actually made a major, if you think about, a delay in street construction, it was a major kind of like citywide delay in street construction, which had a pretty significant impact. So the Maine workers are on strike, and then the New York City workers in solidarity stop working. So this says 1,200 men out. But beyond that, hundreds of miles from the quarries, other stone workers also went on strike around New England, all the way, I think, through Buffalo, kind of like the Northeast core. And so there was an estimated 50 to 100,000 other stoneworkers who were striking. And so this also connected, this touched on everything that was considered important, symbolic, monumental, because it was granite. So that also kind of had a specific flavor of impact. And so around the time John Pierce denied this strike, he was quoted as saying, "There's no strike to speak of in the city." He said men were working everywhere. And he said, anyways, whatever trouble we've got here, that's happening like hundreds of miles away. It doesn't matter. So it's interesting, like he really, that quote, I think really, on the one hand, his company is called New York and Maine Paving Block Company. Like it's literally about that connection. But he's also kind of demonstrating the ideological power of conceptually separating the two. And so he really sought to distance the construction and modernization of New York City from the labor disputes that were happening in Maine. So New York City paving layers stayed on strike until the summer, and then they negotiated with they got the city to agree to lay old, so the used pavers, and to rehire union workers and agree to union rules. So that chapter goes on to explore how the Paving Cutters Union ended up pursuing cooperative business models that allowed them to make 20% more per person. I mean, there's obviously a much longer history there, but essentially that, what we start to see in the early 1920s and 30s is a lot of these, basically the kind of end of the New England granite industry. The federal government decided that all new buildings needed to be made in Indiana limestone. It was a kind of aesthetic decision, and all of a sudden a whole generation of buildings are made with a different material. And then, of course, there's the move towards concrete reinforced with steel, and also rail connections made the water benefit not economical anymore. And so really we start to see the abandonment of quarries. And also granite pavement is replaced by asphalt from Trinidad. So this was a new movement towards like the next level of smoothness, silent and sensuous. Asphalt really changed the city, adding this kind of new smell, a new heat. We've seen that, like the asphalt kind of in the hot summer sun melting. And so if granite really hardened the capitalist street to produce a grand infrastructure of continuity for the 19th century, asphalt would soften the street, poured and rolled into place in the 20th. So this is one of the last motion paving quarries. That was Fred Chiles, who was Bill's great uncle. And Bill took this photo, and it's now totally invisible from the road. You can see there's an osprey, or you could see there's like an osprey has nested on the top of this pole. And a lot of the other large quarries are swimming holes that are either legal or illegal to swim in, but kind of beautiful places to visit. There are a few kind of senior residents who've tried to revitalize the industry more as like a hobby. They call themselves the Four Fossils, but it's not really a business venture. So granite flow between Maine and New York, just to come back to the notion of motion, I think can be seen as a series of motions. So the flow of slowly cooling stone, quarrymen and paving cutters removing blocks from granite ledges, the transport of granite blocks from island quarries going southward, the laying of blocks in New York City streets, the mobility afforded by consistent stone surfaces, and the movement of the granite industry overseas. And I was interested in kind of thinking about this concept of material flow, which is fascinating and derived from different scientific fields, and is able to examine the inextricable relationship between landscape change, capitalism, and labor. And I think it's interesting that in material flow language, the materials are protagonists. They're kind of like they're actors, which is interesting and I think allows us to question their inertness. And so this is, I find, very enticing, but it also tends to erase the social dimension of material flows and the human hands that are part of it. And so I think this case of looking at granite flow from Vinyl Haven to New York City resists this notion of this abstract, invisible material flow because it's so heavy. It's so textured, it's so staunchly physical. It's not anonymous. And so the granite moving here was cut, transported, laid, and finished by thousands of workers who demonstrated their essential role in this flow by shutting it down. And so not invisible, the flow of granite from Vinyl Haven to New York City is expressed instead in the depth of this swimming holes that kids are diving into today. So I think I'll just wrap up. Are we okay? Am I okay for time? Like a couple more minutes? Yeah? Are we done? Yeah? Okay. So just a few last thoughts, maybe to open it up for the rest of the day. I think when I finish this book project, I have some questions that are to me unanswerable, but just kind of wanting to think about what it means to look at materials not as commodities, but as continually changing matter that takes different forms and is shaped by people, but also shapes people. And trying to think about how would understanding these so-called externalities as internalities to design work change the way we practice. And so I guess I'm left trying to think about how if most of the cases that I observed were really quite exploitative and extractive examples, I guess that leads me to think about what are these other kinds of practices that are, and I think what this organization here is doing is about that, is about kind of, reconnecting to design and construction as a land ethic or as a kind of land relationship. So I think that's, again, why I'm so enthusiastic about learning from everybody here. Maybe just really quickly, I can say a few ways that I'm interested in thinking about these questions of how, what land practices do we want to support and what material production aligns with those values? How could certain material use support communities that care for land or strengthen Indigenous sovereignty? How can material reuse honor existing materials and their past extractions? These are questions. And I guess I'm now kind of focusing on Southern Ontario. This is an image showing a project with Alison Kriba about the waves of demolition and landfilling of the city's materials along the shoreline. So a project to try to explore different modes of material stewardship and the reclamation of deconstruction as a practice rather than demolition. Looking at the reclamation and aesthetics of material reuse as a form of landfill diversion, but also a creative opportunity for questioning the life cycles of stone materials. And then looking at the contemporary flows of aggregates in Southern Ontario, where I'm living, as new contested highways and high-rise residential towers spring up in my region. And so these are, I guess, some of the, I guess, contemporary ways that I think some of these issues studied in that book are playing out. So thanks so much for your, time and being here.